So I saw Monkey Man recently, and there's a bit in it where the main character buys a gun. The dealer whips out a pistol, and I can't remember if it was the Combat Master or the Pit Viper, but both would be valid here, because he says something to the tune of, "You like John Wick? This is the one from the movie." Guns would turn out to play a very limited role in what is undoubtedly one of the greatest action movies ever made. Instead, it focuses on brutal, pulse-pounding, hand-to-hand combat, spanning a variety of creative styles, settings, and tones. But despite the relative lack of gunplay in the film, and a story with a much greater focus on social commentary than beautiful action for its own sake, that reference to John Wick turned out to be an apt one to make. There are a number of similarities between the two that, by the time I've made this video, no doubt people will have already pointed out. But it's not a total copy. Monkey Man's camera work was much closer to Paul Greengrass midway through an anxiety attack, and its choreography was designed to be desperate, amateur, and sloppy, all opposed to John Wick's clear, polished, expert action. But despite all of that, it was clear to me that Monkey Man was, forgive the pun, aping a specific aspect of John Wick, that of extensively using colored lighting to tell a story. There's a number of prominent themes throughout the John Wick series that I'm sure I don't need to explain to you, mainly because they keep saying them out loud.
You believe in rules?
Yeah.
You know the rules?
Yeah.
Rules.
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 Yeah.
And what have consequences?
Yeah.
You know the consequences.
Yeah.
Consequences.
Consequences.
Consequences. Yeah. Rules and consequences.
But you also gave me a choice.
Yeah.
A choice.
What choice?
The choice is yours.
I have no choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Turn his rules.
Yeah.
And consequences against him.
Yeah.
Rules.
But now, yeah. Consequences. Yeah.
Our titular main character seems extremely uncomfortable speaking, forcing out almost every word, preferring to speak with his gun, so it's in keeping with his character not to espouse his thoughts in elaborate dialogue. It's emblematic of the creator's approach to storytelling. They're heavily reliant on symbols of all kinds, not just speech, to convey information, character, and plot. At the broadest level, the structure of the series itself is said to be representative of the 5 stages of grief, charting John's mental state as he processes Helen's death. Denial in the first film as he tries to put his violent past behind him and ultimately fails. Anger in the second film as he lashes out at Santino for dragging him back in and betraying him. Bargaining in the third as he makes a deal with the High Table for his life. And depression in the fourth as he embraces death and seeks only to achieve some purpose and rejoin Helen. Who knows if or when John will come back for a fifth to reach acceptance. Then on the micro level, things like the breeds of dog John gets are symbolic of his journey in the first film. He starts off with a beagle, and unless you're like me and remember the absolutely horrifying Good Boy from that set of Welcome to Night Vale episodes, the beagle might just be the cutest and most harmless dog breed anyone can think of. They've got those big stupid floppy ears, they're gentle and sociable to a fault, and let's be real, they're kinda stupid. There's a reason the main puppy in Cats and Dogs is a beagle. It's the perfect breed to match John's attempt at living a peaceful life and the death of that peace, replaced with nearly the polar opposite dog in a black pit bull. Pit bulls are notorious for their reputation of violence, an impression that isn't really borne out by the evidence in controlled studies. It's a hotly debated topic, and nobody really knows for sure whether pit bulls as a breed have a component that makes them more violent and aggressive. And that's a question John often faces. Can he ever live a peaceful life? Or is it in his nature to be this way?
You are a killer.
Nonetheless, people are more wary of pit bulls than other breeds, leading to them often going unadopted from shelters and needing to be euthanized, just like the one John saves at the end. John sees himself in the dog, something alone and unloved, destined to eventually be put down for their violent nature. John's found a will to live despite all he's lost, and sees the dog as deserving of life as well. Then there's the religious elements of the movies, from the endless quoting of Dante's Inferno,
Abandon all hope, you who are about to enter here.
To consistent themes of punishment and retribution, which Christians absolutely froth.
Which is why God took your wife.
And the seemingly regular association of the Catholic Church with this criminal empire, which, no, we don't have time to go into it here. Coding, basically using cultural associations to communicate meaning, is often used in John Wick to evoke the themes of certain genres and subgenres, cowboy westerns for one. There's that extended sequence where John customizes a couple of old revolvers, spins the barrel and nails a single shot, not to mention the dozen or so spaghetti western style musical stings that play throughout the series. Or how about the card game and Mexican standoff between the range of morally grey characters at Killer's Joint? The tracker is fully cowboy coded from top to bottom, what with his quick draw revolver shot and spinning holster, and the fact he uses a lever action rifle as his primary weapon. Like, we can't go into it here, but there's basically no reason to be using a lever action gun in the modern day besides rule of cool, so of course it's in John Wick. Then there's the artwork. Have you ever noticed how much art is featured in John Wick? In the second film, Santino seems to be basically holed up at this one art gallery, with the various meetings between him, John, and Winston taking place there, and the final fight scene occurring in various exhibits throughout the museum. The third branches out with scenes in a library, a museum of antique weaponry, a ballet venue, and the glass exhibit in the final fight at the New York Continental. Then there's the fourth film where, again, the villain is posted up in the middle of an art museum, this time the Louvre, where they conduct a good number of their meetings, and there's an entire floor of the Osaka Continental that's devoted to both artwork and combat training for some reason. In-universe, symbols rule the world of the assassins, like the coins they exchange for goods and services, seemingly without any consistent exchange rate, and more as a gesture of gratitude, a social contract, as Barada outlines in his monologue. That extends to other physical representations of abstract concepts, like the markers used to signify debts owed, the hourglasses the Harbinger and the Marquis used to count down to the New York Continental's destruction, or the chessboard on Winston's desk, representing his maneuvering. I'd love to take a look at the board in detail and see if it represents anything in the story, but who am I kidding? I ain't Lord Ravenscraft. I say all of this to convince anybody uninitiated just how much John Wick relies on symbols to communicate. That's partly so you understand and appreciate how much effort goes into the non-verbal, non-plot storytelling of the films, and partly so that I don't get quite as many dumb fucking "duh, the curtains are blue because they're blue" comments on this video, because the primary thing that I want to talk about today is how John Wick uses color. It's been nigh on 10 years since the first movie came out and rocked people's socks off, so doubtless plenty will have already pointed out the part color plays in telling the story of the film. Likewise, you almost certainly know the premise, and the story doesn't go much further beyond that, so I'll breeze through this early summary and analysis. John Wick is a retired assassin whose wife dies from a terminal illness. She leaves him a beagle puppy called Daisy, so he has someone to love after she's gone. Except oh no, Alfie Allen is still in his phase of being the most hated actor in Hollywood, so he steals John's beloved car and kills the dog. John swears revenge and systematically destroys a criminal empire to get back at Alfie Allen and his father. After achieving victory, he finds a new will to live, rescues another puppy from being put down, and heads home. I skipped over a lot, but that's all we need to get started. The rest can come later. The first major thing to identify is warmth. In the opening montage, there's a stark divide between the warm, sunny tones of John's happy memories with Helen and the cold, blue present of life without her. It's fairly textbook stuff, but its consistency is useful in creating associations for the viewer and establishing a visual shorthand for emotions and characters. At first, the only thing that's coloured in these warm tones is Helen, and when she's taken from him, John's life is cold, only barely lighting up during the wake at the home they shared, as the day is filled with memories of her and likely friends of John's. Speaking of, isn't it a bit weird that no one checks in on John or seems disturbed to find his house blew up and he disappeared like 2 weeks after his wife's death? That's fridge logic, never mind. The warm colours return in full when Daisy arrives, as love is brought back into John's life and he has someone to grieve with. He's still almost always coloured lightly blue, but now at least he has bright spot. That extends to his car during his magic hour driving scene, establishing his car and his dog as the only two things that bring him happiness anymore. And those colours almost entirely disappear from the rest of the film when both are taken from him, leaving everything tinted a blue-grey, mirroring his grief and steely determination to have his revenge. The only other times we get a glimpse of the warmth of before are when John explains to Viggo what the dog meant to him, bearing all of the love and pain he's been carrying, and when John's real friends are on screen. Winston is one, of course, and Francis counts here too, but take Marcus for a much more in-depth example. He was initially introduced at Helen's funeral in a scene that could be construed as ominous or threatening. Regardless, John isn't welcoming to remnants of his old life, and certainly not while he's in mourning, so the scene is coloured appropriately. Yet when Viggo asks Marcus to kill John, and he ostensibly accepts, he's wearing a gold robe, drinking carrot juice, and generally highlighted in warmer colours, in contrast to the pale white and blue lighting up Viggo, marking him as a secret ally of John's, something that'll become more and more obvious in the lighting as his true allegiance and disruptions to Viggo's plans come out in the the open. But at the end of the day, this is mostly to establish the intense binary of emotions John experiences in a short period of time, swinging wildly between love and contentment to deep, dark depression. At the end of the film, after adopting a new puppy, he emerges from the blue light of the pound and his depression into the warmer lights of the city, ready to move forward. The scene is set at the same bridge he frequented with Helen. That serves as a useful indication of his emotional state at the end of the film by comparison. He's not as happy as he was when Helen was around, but he's got something, a spark to keep him going. Before we move on, it's also worth pointing out that the color scheme of John's clothes mirror his two dogs. He starts out wearing Daisy's colors of brown and white, a white that's stained with blood after her death. Then he rescues a black pit bull that matches the dark suits he wears when he's killing, signifying his reacceptance of this side of himself, and his newfound resolution to live, despite the darkness that surrounds him. But now, let's talk about some of the bolder colors of the film. Blue obviously follows John around for the whole movie, as we've discussed, but red first makes its way into the picture through the blood on John when Yosef and co break into his house, immediately associating the color with violence. Yes, blood is usually red, but this red is vibrant, saturated. It's been designed to stand out in the frame. Compare the look of the blood on John's shirt here to what that same blood looks like in his meeting with Aurelio. Then, in the first time Vigo appears on screen, he's wearing a bright crimson shirt, plainly establishing him as a man of violence. When he starts beating the crap out of Yosef, he takes off his jacket, wearing the violence openly, though it was barely concealed before. This also works as quick and easy bad guy coding. You don't have to dig deep to find a movie, or more commonly, a video game, where all of the bad guys are conveniently wearing bright red uniforms so that you and the hero can pick them out of the frame. Sure enough, when John attacks the fittingly named Red Circle Club, all of Vigo's cronies are dressed in red uniforms. John has successfully managed to remove violence from his life with Helen, but when he takes out the hit squad at his house and Jimmy the cop arrives, the red lights of his car completely illuminate the windows. The violence has followed John to the peaceful home he'd built. It's just outside his door, trying its best to get in, while he denies that he's truly back in business. When John checks in at the Continental and visits the bar in the basement, we're introduced to another stark color, green. Green is a color that will grow over the series to embody the Continental and, more broadly, the middle management of this world, the rules and order of ground-level, day-to-day assassinating. On the surface, the Continental is painted with neutral tones, but here in the basement, away from prying eyes, where these hitters don't need to hide who they are, it's bathed in neon green light. Green light, and a not insignificant amount of red in the lighting and decor, highlighting the violence inherent in their trade. It's particularly notable how individual characters are lit within this scene. Winston is under a warm, natural-looking light, marking him not just as a colleague, but as a friend of John's. Addie, who I'm kind of annoyed never comes up again in the series for how close she seemed with John, is just about the greenest thing in the bar, identifying her as loyal to the Continental. This is in marked contrast with Perkins, the only assassin in the joint under a red light, foreshadowing her betrayal of John later in the movie, and kinda the same scene. When John enters Vigo's church safe house, he's flanked by red candles, signifying the true purpose of the building and the violence John is bringing to the place. The loss of all of his money and blackmail in the vault effectively destroys Vigo's empire, and from this point on, he's dressed in maroon as opposed to the scarlet of his earlier outfits, perhaps signifying his fading power. But all of the lighting and grading techniques used come to a head in the best scene of the film, the fight at the Red Circle. Here, everything is bathed in bright, contrasting red and blue as John prepares to execute Yosef. It's the culmination of everything inside of John, the violent desire for revenge that's been bursting out of him all movie, embodied in the red, and the grief and loss fueling him, brought out in the blue. Under this light, all the life is stripped from John's face, making him appear more like a ghost. John is no longer defending his home or his family. He's here to commit as many murders as needed to get his revenge. He's not really living, he's just answering death with more death. This is also classic lighting for a showdown between the good guy and the bad guy. You could go back to Monkey Man to highlight that, but a more relatable example would be Star Wars for obvious reasons. Even besides the lightsabers themselves, you have the lighting in the Bespin duel washing over Luke and Vader, signifying duality and the elemental struggle between good and evil. In the Red Circle scene, John moves in and out of red and blue light as each aspect becomes more highlighted by the scene's content. When he kills Victor, for instance, before the real violence has started and he's all up in his feelings, talking about his dog and his car, he's completely covered in blue. When he stabs this guy, as he continues to gaze into his eyes without even flinching as the man dies, he slowly becomes immersed in red light, showing off John's callous brutality. The lighting follows the balance of power between John and his opponents as well, with the scene becoming completely bathed in red when Kirill gets the upper hand. I've always been a little disappointed with the ending. John's wiped out an entire army on his way to Yosef, only ever really struggling with an assassin on his level, but here he is in a mostly even fight against just some guy. But conceptually, there's something bitter and sad about how grungy this ending is. They're not even fighting to live, they're just fighting to kill the other. Vigo has lost everything by this point, and John lets Vigo stab him purely so he can get a hold of the knife to stab him back. With nothing to lose and really nothing else left to fight for, they're exposed, stripped of all their pretenses, their veneer of civilization and sophistication.
We were professionals. Civilized. Do I look civilized to you?
At the end of the day, these are just two human beings trying to kick the other to death. And fittingly, they're lit in one of the only instances of neutral white light, uncolored by any complex motive. Moving into the second film, the color palette and general approach to lighting is noticeably different. The warm-cold contrast that anchored the emotions of the first film is mostly gone, bar a few moments associated with Helen, and that's for good reason. This one isn't about John's relationship with his late wife, at least it's no longer just about that. It's about John's reluctance to re-enter his old life. It's about cycles of violence and revenge, and it's the first real expansion of those themes of rules and consequences that were more implicit in the first film via characters like Perkins and Winston, but would grow to dominate the series as a whole. There are still some surface level associations from the first film that come up again. For one, Abram, Vigo's brother, is introduced wearing red, associating him with Vigo and violence. Much of the Continental's branding is still red for the same reason, and admittedly it would be strange if they'd found the time to reupholster in the week between films. Santino's side hoes are both wearing red, and he's responsible for reintroducing the color back into John's life via the blood from the marker and the fire from his house burning down, though he never wears the color himself. Perhaps it's stating something about how he distances himself from the violence, having others do it on his behalf and running away from it in the end, in contrast to Vigo, who gets his hands dirty on many more occasions. Likewise, blue remains strongly associated with John, most notably with the tunnel shootout being entirely blue. This is John's domain. He's planned for this engagement, planting guns all throughout the place, and he absolutely outclasses everyone there. In the previous film, he struggled a fair bit against his opponents, getting injured over time to the point where he has to have an honest-to-God fist fight with Vigo that didn't end immediately with him killing him with a fucking feather or something stupid. He was out of practice and arguably blinded by rage, but here he's back to his prime, and he impassively rinses everyone in the moody blue tunnels. I could say that the use of green for the contract messaging system is tied into their association with the order and management of the assassin world, but I honestly believe that if this is green for any particular reason, it's a Matrix reference.
Guns. Lots of guns.
Red and blue, just like in the first film, are the only bold colors that are really picked to pop out in a scene, and also like the first, they usually color John's action scenes. The first notable instance would be in the montage of him fighting the other assassins, but it's omnipresent in the fight in the mirror exhibit. That one feels especially deliberate, like they want you to be thinking about the iconic red and blue lighting in the red circle sequence, but the addition of the mirrors evokes so many ideas. Refraction, for one. Things aren't as straightforward as John trying to kill the guy who killed his dog. There are a complicated mess of social relationships and obligations that color his actions here, so the scene is lit with these hazy waves of red and blue bouncing from mirror to mirror. The idea of something coming back to you, of retribution, is another. Again, it's all the same idea as the first film, just with extra steps. Instead of they killed his dog so he's gonna kill them back, it's John did a thing for Santino and dipped a toe back into the killing game, so Santino's using their marker now, making John kill Gianna, which makes Cassian want to kill him and causes Santino to put a hit on him, which prompts John to go on a revenge spree via the Bowery King and kill Santino, which gets John excommunicated, yada yada yada. It's all an endless back and forth of payback, a mirror reflecting violence back at the perpetrator.
An eye for an eye, John. You know how it goes.
Then there's the most literal read, reflection, or rather lack of reflection would be more appropriate here. Both John and Santino either fail to anticipate the depth of the consequences of their actions, or deliberately ignore them at great cost to themselves. Santino double-crosses John, which,
not a great plan.
And John kills Santino on continental grounds, putting himself in 2 movies worth of trouble. Both characters in this moment are forced to reflect on the violence they put out into the world, embodied in the red and blue that's become associated with the emotional violence in John Wick. Or, they just wanted to try and shoot an action scene in a hall of mirrors as a flex. Also a valid read. The main contrast this time around is between light and dark, and at this point in my initial script I went off on a massive tangent about anamorphic lenses, custom work with Ari, and specific techniques like using something not dissimilar to fishing wire to artificially add lens flare, which was all really fascinating and had nothing whatsoever to do with color. So we're just going to skip that here, and I highly recommend you go check out interviews with Dan Lausson, the DP on chapters 2 to 4. But in summary, their objective in this film was to achieve a cool, slick look characterized by high contrast separation between pitch blacks, vibrant light, and bold colors. This is the only time we see John working legitimately as an assassin, executing contracts under the table, so the lighting and cinematography reflects that. This time, everything is glossy and classy, featuring a lot of cool white light, as opposed to the extreme temperatures of before. The neon pops more than ever, with highly saturated colors contrasting sharply with darkness. It's not to signify that John is any less emotional in his actions than the first. He's still grieving, and he's somehow even more pissed off, but he's partly come to terms with that, initially trying to rebury the Baba Yaga, but after Santino drags him back once more, reluctantly accepting that it's part of who he is.
You wanted me back. I'm back.
Things are much more verisimilitudinous than before overall, as if John has reached some sense of reality after the initial world-upending experience of his wife's death. In the initial scenes of him trying to settle down again, talking to Aurelio and Winston, all the colors are highly saturated, and he looks far more human, far more alive. The saturation brings out in particular the green of nature, which I think you're meant to compare to this unnatural, sickly green tint in Abrams' office. Now that he's properly back and out in the world, getting involved in affairs other than his own, he's been exposed. Consequently, he's brightly and sometimes harshly lit, and in cold, emotionless colors. In his meetings with the sommelier and the cartographer, they're lit from below by powerful beams of white light, and in the scene with the tailor, it's the same, just from above. That feeling only increases as the film goes on, when Santino puts out the hit on John, leading to the showdown with Cassian in the white subway station, John attacking Santino out in the open under the cold gallery lights, and when John speaks with Winston in the crisp morning light after being declared excommunicado. This is matched by an extreme darkness present in other scenes, like the fight through the tunnels, but more commonly, a sharp contrast between light and dark present throughout it all. Those luminescent strip lights cast deep shadows, something the first film did extensively, frequently silhouetting characters or nearly entirely obscuring them in darkness, and continuing in full force in the second. And it's here that we need to break to discuss genre, and in particular what some of you have been likely screaming at the screen this whole time, noir. Film noir is a genre as notable for its visual style as it is for its tone. It emerged mainly from two sources. One, a spread of the German expressionist movement of the early 20th century to the US, and the other, the popularity of hard-boiled fiction, essentially the most grimdark of all crime stories, in the US in the wake of the Great Depression. They were the ultimate pessimistic films. Typical themes of classic noir would be monochrome, high-contrast visuals with heavy shadows, brought in from German expressionist cinema, and an unjust world with no real good guys per se, and no chance of a happy ending, which often featured in pulpy hard-boiled stories. Most of the action would happen at night, where the dark underbelly of the city would come alive, and there'd often be femme fatales, grimy cityscapes, people smoking constantly, and crime plots helmed by detectives with psychological issues and drinking problems. Fast forward through a heckin' lot of film history that we don't really have time to go through, the end of black and white cinema, and the escalation of a Cold War, and the landscape of noir changes dramatically. By around the late 1970s and 80s, critics and scholars start identifying neo-noir as a subgenre of its own. Neo-noir would carry forward a lot of the same themes as film noir, from its narrative elements of grey morality, crime and revenge, and its visual elements like chiaroscuro lighting, aka a heavy contrast between light and dark, emphasis on the dark. Typically, neo-noirs are more violent, focus more on sociological than psychological issues, though not exclusively, and involve a much greater use of colour with the evolution of filming technology. Its subject matter also adapted to issues that weren't present in classic film noir, like the threat of nuclear annihilation and the rise of consumer electronics. There isn't exactly a set definition for neo-noir, as opposed to the fairly narrow classic film noir. You could quite easily take any modern story about detectives or crime and make a reasonable argument that it's neo-noir. If The Batman is neo-noir, and Inception is neo-noir, and The Nice Guys is also neo-noir, you're losing the meaning somewhat. It's this dilution of the term that's led to a splitting of noir into numerous other classifications to help group the differing approaches, such as tech noir, embodied in films like Minority Report or Ex Machina, reckoner, Western noir, such as No Country for Old Men or The Revenant, comedy noir like Who Framed Roger Rabbit and The Nice Guys, or more relevant for our purposes, neon noir. Neon noir as a clearly identifiable subgenre pretty much starts with the films of Michael Mann in the 80s and 90s, and essentially, as the name implies, it's noir but with lots of neon. That's being a bit facetious though, because the neon's not just there for visual aesthetics. Neo noir had a much greater emphasis on social critique than its cousins, with the city and its aesthetics forming the backdrop and repository for these feelings. In a world characterized by globalization, late consumer capitalism, urban expansion, and increasingly omnipresent technology, neon noir often features questions about identity, relating to race, gender, and class, with some pretty pessimistic outlooks on all of them. It's often tied to the burgeoning cyberpunk genre for the same reasons: bright, colorful technology contrasting with the dark, oppressive shadows they create. John Wick is unarguably one of the most prominent examples of 21st century neo-noir. Visually speaking, it has the typical high contrast between deep blacks and bold colors, the distinctive nighttime visuals of billboards, rain-slick streets, and neon lights reflecting off of things like car surfaces. It carries the same explorations of morality through its conflicted hero, committing acts of extreme violence out of revenge or a personal moral code. Where the series differs is in taking everything to the fucking max. Neo-noirs are commonly described as hazy, dreamlike, an expression of those feelings of derealization and alienation that I mentioned before. Listen, I can't speak for your dreams, but mine usually involve much less glass smashing and much less comedy. Instead of the moody synthwave common in the genre, John Wick has a soundtrack of pulsing techno, or classical music where the percussion is gunshots. Oh, you got your nice transcendent plinkety Vangelis soundtrack? Fuck that, says John Wick, we're headed to the club! A common feature of prior neo-noirs would be a long driving scene where our hero or heroes will simply drive somewhere, usually saying nothing. It's the ultimate expression of loneliness, surrounded on all sides by other people and the lights of life, but they pass by in a blur. The city looms large in the background and on the surfaces of the car, ever present, ever consuming. No matter how far they drive, they can't seem to escape. Here's John Wick's driving scenes. But that doesn't mean that this isn't still noir. John's story is essentially a protracted existential crisis, facing constant questions about his true nature and the man he wants to be, and both the cinematography and the literal plot of a world where seemingly every other person on the street is a secret assassin emphasize the feelings of alienation and depersonalization in the city. It's telling that when his life is disrupted in the first two films, he leaves his suburban home upstate to go to the city. And while it's not overtly questioning the established system of late capitalism and American consumerism, the constant talk of rules and how one is supposed to act as a moral individual within their system, along with the overarching story of attempting to alter or otherwise overthrow an oppressive regime led by the unreachable 1% who control all trade and commerce, and by extension all systems of power and governance, and you could make a strong case that John Wick functions as anti-capitalist critique. It is worth mentioning that Chad Stahelski, David Leitch, and Derek Kolstad generally reject the idea of an allegorical or metaphorical meaning to John Wick, and instead just wanted to make action movies that look cool. But fuck auteur theory, read what you want into whatever you want. If anything, the chiaroscuro elements in the film become more pronounced as they go on, with the filmmaking team making bolder and bolder choices with the visual design, but retaining the light-dark contrast characteristic of a neo-noir. I won't have anything new to say about it though, so just keep in the back of your mind going forward, with every bright color I'm talking about, there's a concurrent shadow that the team allowed to be cast as well. Here in the third film, we get some clear instances of the classic John Wick red and blue, like this bit in the taxi, with one colour flanking either side. But the main notable thing about colour in this one is the reintroduction of using it as an indicator of alignment. We first saw this in how comparatively warmly a character was lit, and the use of certain bold colours to pick out villains from a crowd. This time, it's a pretty binary divide, with blues and greens for John and those on his side, and orange for the high table and those loyal to them, which is very annoying for the purposes purposes of this video because of the nature of cinematic language. Big budget action adventure movies, and largely movies as a whole, tend to prioritize blue and orange for a number of reasons. Oranges and yellows are highlighted to maximize the impact of things like explosions, muzzle flash, and other action elements, with the added benefit of heightening the vibrancy of tanned skin, not uncommon in Hollywood. Blue has a similar effect in boosting the color of things like water in the sky, especially in conjunction with the orange of the sun, and emphasizing a downer mood, the idiomatic blue curtains. Add to that, blue and orange are complementary colors, so the use of one often necessitates the use of the other to create a visually pleasing image in a kind of positive feedback loop. Sometimes in John Wick, the scene really is just orange and blue because that's what you do. These random assassins aren't colored blue because they're on John's side, they're literally on their way to murder him. It's just because it's night, it's raining, John Wick is a neo-noir, and that's what we expect it to look like, thanks to, I guess, Blade Runner. So I'll try my best to separate out the scenes that are colored a certain way because of some subtextual meaning unique to this film, and the ones that are more emulating the aesthetics of neo-noir and 21st century action cinema. Generally, if I can't see any reason for it to be that way, I'll assume there's no other reason than looks pretty, man. If you don't buy into the ones I do decide to highlight and interpret here, which I could especially understand with the orange parts, just you fucking wait for the fourth film. Anyway, this shift to color by alignment makes a lot of sense thematically. This film is about John calling in favor after favor, desperately trying to find some way to get rid of the hit on him. Everyone he meets should technically kill him or turn him away by the rules of their society, but they ultimately decide to help him. This one is about loyalty, the social obligations we have to each other, and the consequences of these choices. Barada basically spells it out midway through the film.
The commerce of relationships. A social contract in which you agree to partake.
So what kind of loyalties are tested? Well, we start the film with a pretty blatant one with the Doctor, which I believe is meant to set the scene for this as a consistent theme. Out in the corridor, John is lit entirely with bright blue neon, while the Doctor is lit with orange light from within. He initially denies John, citing the excommunicado and standing by his loyalty to the table. But ultimately, he helps him for the 5 minutes he has available, and in the rest of the scene, he's colored in John's blue. Later, John visits the Ruscaroma for help, and he's immediately met with hostility in the form of the dominant orange light in the lobby and the seats of the hall. The only blue in the scene is the spotlight on the ballerina, and some blue neon lining the walkway, lighting John from underneath. He has a slim light of hope that this one internal rule they have can supersede the other rule imposed from above. It's not just blue and orange, however. This movie sees the return of green to the picture in a major way, really only coming up before now in the first film during the Continental Bar scene. Here, the green once again represents the middle management level of work under the high table. It starts off faint, with a greenish tinge over the lobby in the New York Continental, and paired with the orange that's always been present there. At this point, Winston is generally loyal to the table, only escalating to open rebellion once the adjudicator comes. But the presence of green here where there wasn't any prior is a reflection of the hour he gave John, an exertion of his own will in defiance of the strict rules of the table. It comes up again when John goes to see Sophia. She's loyal to the high table in order to keep her daughter safe, so orange, but she's also management, so green. But more importantly, just like Winston, she allows her personal loyalties to supersede her loyalty to the table, which is why she has that divide, rather than characters like Barada and the Adjudicator, who were lit almost universally in shades of orange, indicating their uncompromising allegiance to the high table. At the pinnacle, you have the Elder, who dwells in the bright orange desert, but himself is colored in more neutral tones. He's not of the table, he exists above it. In the showdown with John and Sophia against Barada's men, the scene is lit with green and orange lighting throughout, something that'll become a theme as the series progresses. The conflict grows beyond John and his personal reasons for killing, and extends to those under the table chafing at their rule. Increasingly powerful people, and in greater and greater numbers, ally with John against the high table. John may still fight for his love of Helen, and extensions of her, be that Daisy, or even himself to keep the memory of her alive, but he's only able to do so, only empowered and enabled because these individual factions use him for their own ends. He becomes a symbol of the power under the table, and a tool to achieve their goals. Zero's shop is an interesting one. Out front, the two dominant colors are red and green, which speak to his character. He and his students have many opportunities to kill John in the climax of the film, but choose not to, mostly for the love of the fight. Sure, he'll obey the high table when called upon, but his personal values take priority in the moment. He's developed killing into an art form that he's proud of, and his individual streak wins out more often than not, so we have red and green. Then there's the meeting between John and Winston, and the scene is entirely blue. These two characters aren't opposed to each other, they're on the same side, and in this room, separate from outside influences, they choose to work together. It's contrasted wonderfully against the parley with the Adjudicator, where Winston ostensibly betrays John and reaffirms his loyalty to the High Table, a turn foreshadowed in the prominent orange light of the rising sun and the fire, and brought home in the absence of green in the hotel once again. Besides the colour, the visuals are reminiscent of the mirror scene in the previous film, with the reflections and swirling abstract displays. Just like then, this is a moment of reflection, for John to make a choice about what kind of man he's gonna be. It's a test, revealing what truly matters to John, and the scene is set appropriately with glass and white neon strip lights. Winston specifically makes reference to the transparency of the room. Then, in the final showdown, we get the boldest use of artificial colour yet, when the hotel lights up in bright green neon. Winston is declaring the hotel as his turf, not the High Table's. This is his pushback, his display of the Continental's strength. Through John specifically, these jagweeds absolutely aren't helping. I like this cute throwback to the first film, with the return of the classic John Wick lighting as he comes out from this door and fights a bunch of dudes around a pool. It's not saying anything in particular, I don't think, except remember how cool that first scene was, and look what we can do now that we couldn't do then. Rule of cool is and continues to be an abiding law in John Wick. It's why I don't really have much to say about the showdown with Zero and his students. I genuinely think they just wanted to set a fight scene in a glass and neon room purely for the visual spectacle, and that is reason enough for me. However, it does attain meaning later on, as this is the moment Zero enters the fray. Zero is doing the classic bad guy, we're not so different you and I shtick, which John denies. Later on, when it's just the two of them left, we get a brief glimpse of the classic red and blue again, and Zero appears under the same dual lighting, saying,
See? We're the same.
Instead, Zero seems to be more who John was, and who he would have been had he accepted the Elder's offer. A killer and nothing more, who can only take pleasure in being the best at killing. The difference between them, as cheesy as it sounds, is that John has something to live for and fight for, whereas Zero lives only for the fight. Then, the film ends with the Bowery King declaring war against the High Table, asking,
You pissed, John? Are you?
And John looks up. If you've sat through all my talk about colours so far, I feel like I don't need to say anything more. Brief note, in making this video, I also remembered that the Continental TV show exists, and gave that a watch to see if it had anything worthy of note. The neo-noir elements are up to the max, but the colours are much more muted, as is usually the case in period flicks. Red had a good showing, between the red lights indicating business can be done on Continental grounds, the lights at the New Year's party, and this bit.
I need guns. Lots of guns.
And there was the intense orange light in this scene with the Adjudicator, but there wasn't really much to say overall. Unsurprising, given this was a completely different creative team, but disappointing nonetheless. Decent miniseries overall though. Here in John Wick 4, the, until further notice, last film in the core series, we see the apotheosis of all this colour shit. The most, I don't want to say simplistic exactly, because that seems a little demeaning. More like monolithic. You'll see what I mean. The most useful thing to do here, I feel, is just to run through the film in chronological order. We open with several rising suns, burnt orange filling the screen, interspersed with John getting ready for the fight and killing the riders in the desert. John is on the offensive, and the High Table, represented in orange, is rising to meet him. The desert fight is blue and orange, naturally, given that it's a personal battle for John, trying to get his wedding ring back from the Elder. So I mentioned in the section on John Wick 3 that the orange association might seem like a bit of a stretch to some, given the nature of cinematic lighting and basic colour theory, and to just wait for John Wick 4 to be convinced. Well, here you go. I mean, goddamn. The Marquis represents all the dominating force of the High Table and thusly is coloured in an all-encompassing orange. It's everywhere, not just from the sun, but from neon lights framing these reliefs. When we next see the Marquis, the room is orange once again, but he's also wearing a bright red jacket, bringing the violence motif back around. While he does employ hitmen like Kane and Chidi, he's also a man not afraid to personally commit violent acts, like shooting Charon and stabbing the tracker. Next up, we go to the Osaka Continental, lit up in blazing red. Unsurprising given it's a house of violence, but also a bit of blue, and when we're introduced to Koji, he's completely bathed in blue light, signifying to the audience that this is an ally of John's. Then we get this moment between Koji and John.
Apparently not.
After doing this video, paying specific attention to this stuff, and watching these films a dozen times, I think this might be my favorite moment in all of John Wick. If we can extend this beyond just color for a moment, I need to gush about how well composed this shot is. It isolates John in a third of the frame, with the rest dominated by the cherry tree, all backed by this weird neon installation. John is alone, trying to find a modicum of peace amongst the darkness and violence of his world. Cherry blossoms are often associated with impermanence, due to the tendency of large cultivars of the trees to bloom suddenly and simultaneously in late spring. They're used in art to evoke the fragile and transient nature of life and the wistfulness of things passing. Frankly, it would have been a crime to not slap a massive one next to John Wick when he visits Japan. Prompted by the question of whether or not he's found peace, and framed in such a way that you can see his missing ring finger, it evokes so much. Helen's passing, Daisy's death, the 5 years of peace John had with them before it all came crashing down, the many lives he's ended, the destruction of all John's refuges, and the deaths of his friends along the way. And that soundtrack by Tyler Bates and Joel Richard, lordy Lucifer. I went and listened to the whole thing on Spotify separately to hear if that melody was used as some kind of motif, but no dice unfortunately, unless I'm missing something, which is very possible. I'm not a music YouTuber. This being one of the only times it's used has probably added to my obsession with it.
Who is he?
But we are here talking about color, and this one is the epitome of John Wick. Koji asks him if he's finally at peace, and we're answered with a cut to John, alone in the black of night, lit only with harsh neon red. He turns to face Koji, and his face becomes lit up with blue, completing the classic John Wick pairing and wearing his grief openly. Koji gets his answer.
Apparently not.
The hotel lobby initially has faintly orange lighting, but when Koji decides to fight back against the high table, he flicks a switch and turns the whole place green, just like in the New York Continental, bar some orange neon. This ends up being the biggest color contrast throughout the rest of the film as well, the green of Continental management against the high table's orange. It comes up repeatedly during this sequence, only really breaking for this blue and orange fight centered around Kane, perhaps speaking to his internal conflict. It's personal for him. John and Koji are his friends, but he's forced to ally with the table for the sake of his daughter, just like Sophia. Honestly though, I think this one is colored this way simply to separate it visually from the other conflicts on the roof, in the lobby, in the weird art training room, and the garden, which all have their own slightly unique palettes. But this is primarily a fight to defend the Continental, so green is the key color here, like in John and Akira scenes in the lobby's upper floor, with the orange becoming more prominent as the balance of power shifts and the high table take the upper hand, culminating in the duel between Koji and Kane, the manager of the Continental and the agent of the table respectively. We enter another pure blue domain in the bizarre training room / art gallery, signifying the dominance John has over his opponents. Trained assassins like the one T and Akira fought give them a run for their money, but these are the same kind of mooks he took out in the New York Continental. He's got their number now. It also serves as a visual throwback to the fight with Zero and his assassins in the previous film. When John and Akira escape on the train, it's conveniently painted and lit in the John Wick colors. How sweet of its designers to have the thematic resonance of these two in mind when they were putting it together. For how bold they got with their colors in this film when compared to previous ones, just look at the train scenes in John Wick 2. When Akira steps on and it leaves the station, all but the red lights flicker and go out. John has brought violence to her home, resulting in her father's death, and she hates him for it. But more than that, she now has the same thirst for vengeance as John does, this time for Kane, so she's taken on John's colors, grief and, in this moment, primarily violence. We go back to the marquee and more orange, obviously. Then John rocks up at the Ruskaroma church, its door flanked by green neon lights and a general green ambiance in the street. Despite being a family with a seat at the table, they've got the colors of the rebellious management faction, foreshadowing their backing of John. It's complemented by orange though, as at this point they're reluctantly allied with the high table and opposed to John. Back to the marquee, and would you look at that, it's orange. And more orange lights when they rock up at Killer's place, given he's the head of the Berlin seat and sided with the high table. I could make a lot out of the lights in the actual fight between John and Killer at the Heaven and Hell Club. It alternates between red, blue, green, and orange, the four dominant colors of the film and the series as a whole, and all the points I could make about what they represent are obvious. Violence, the high table, management, and revenge for a murder. It's all present. But look, at the end of the day, this is a club, and I feel like this one is more evoking the general sense of neo-noir than playing with color by association. This is also my least favorite fight scene in the film, probably because it's very second act filler, and there's nothing that really marks it as unique in the series. We've had a fight in a nightclub, we've had dogs taking part in a fight, and we've seen John use hand-to-hand weapons before. It's fine and all, but they raised the bar too high, and this movie is long enough as it is. We get another marquee scene that's, of course, everyone say it with me, orange. Then there's the negotiations on the Plaza Trocadero, and it's worth pointing out here how all of these outside daytime scenes, usually two men planning or negotiating, are coloured with cool blues and greys. There's the one with Winston and John at the Columbarium, and Winston and the Bowery King outside the destroyed Continental. These function as moments to catch your breath in between the relentless high-octane murder, and they're coloured appropriately to calm you the fuck down and lower those cortisol and adrenaline levels. Hey kids, it's another scene with the marquee! Can you guess what the dominant color of the scene is? I'll give you a hint. Eminem can rhyme it with anything. That's right, it's Feldgrau! No, of course it's fucking orange, and maybe the most orange that there could possibly be. The Marquis is out in full force to stop John now. And this is where we can essentially cut this thing short, because the entire battle from here on out is lit entirely with orange and green lighting. The train station John meets Winston and the Bowery King at, the Marquis at his little tabletop model, the radio station, all of the gang hideouts, the fight outside the cafes, the fight around the Arc de Triomphe, the fight in the building. It's everywhere and non-stop until he reaches the duel. Just like in the third film, this conflict has moved beyond John's personal feelings and desires. John is the champion of Winston, the Bowery, the Ruska Roma, all of the parties chafing against the restriction and mistreatment from above, and he's arrayed against the power of the Marquis and the High Table. Green versus orange. But there's another scene just before the final fight that's almost completely orange. It's this one between John and Kane in the church. This really threw me off because this scene isn't about the High Table. Yeah, these two are gonna have to fight each other tomorrow because of the table's rules, so this brief moment of respite, the two standing like an oasis with the orange surrounding them, could be a representation of that. But that felt like a bit of a stretch to me. Thinking on it further, I realized that orange wasn't being used in this film solely to indicate alignment to the High Table. Rather, it, and the sun by extension, were also being associated with death, and in particular those the main characters have lost. John is here to pay his respects to Helen. He and Kane commiserate over Koji and Kane's daughter, who isn't dead but is lost to him. It goes all the way back to the first and second film's flashbacks to Helen, and the scene between John and Vigo where they talk about John's losses. The orange candles lighting the church, and the fires lit in front of Charon's memorial, where the characters reflect on the people they've lost, the meaning of a person's life, and the possibility of life after death. They're just a small moment of anticipation before the ultimate moment their fates will be decided under the fiery sun. The story, one about John embracing death as an end to his torment and giving some meaning to his life of violence, is bookended with sunrises. We open on 3 separate ones in New York, the desert, and Paris respectively, as we're ushered back into this world of death, and we close on several more. The Marquis says,
"A new day is dawning."
And Winston talks about the Marquis bringing John into the light, his light. The light of the sun is a metaphor for change and death, ushered in by the Marquis and their conflict with him. The sun rises as John and Kane reach the top, signaling the advent of one side or the other's deaths. Afterwards, as John collapses on the steps, dying, he gazes into the sun, and we get glimpses of the old flashbacks of Helen. He's no longer fighting to stay alive, for the sake of remembering her. He just wants to be with her again, wherever she is. His memories of her are warm, so when he looks for her, he looks to the sun. We close out the film with Winston and the Bowery King saying goodbye at John's grave under the orange light of a morning sun. To tie this all together, the John Wick series is not complicated. It's packed full of arguably unnecessarily expansive world building and lore. They get longer and longer every time with a growing host of factions and characters, and everyone speaks like a preacher or a supervillain or in one-word sentences, but it's not complicated. It may seem like an obvious thing to say about an action movie, but a lot of its story is conveyed through action. I don't just mean the action of shooting this person or stabbing that person, although that does make up a not insignificant significant portion, and usually carries more meaning than the simple intention of making that person not alive anymore. I mean the symbolic acts rife throughout the whole series: sliding a coin across a table, eating a piece of fugu sashimi, sharing a drink. All of these things in isolation mean very little, but in the context of the film, speak much louder than some words could have. Talking does make up a part of this as well, but the deliberately brusque and repetitive dialogue directs you to observe its visuals for depth instead. Color makes up just one of the many visual design choices made in the John Wick films that help you as the audience feel a, let's face it, relatively sparse story on a much more primal, elemental level. It's appropriate for a film with characters whose personal loyalties and values, what they truly feel to be right and wrong, consistently come into conflict with larger extrinsic pressures. The outcome is to color scenes boldly and extensively with expressions of these conflicting emotions and conflicting allegiances, and in doing so, not only more effectively and distinctly convey the story, but also meaningfully advance the genre of neo-noir to a wider movie-going audience. Ever since it first came out in 2014, I feel like we keep finding new things to admire about the John Wick franchise. You can just add this one to the pile. Thank you ever so much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed the video. Now, I have two scripts just sitting around waiting to be made into videos. One about the significance of all the artwork in John Wick, and another on its religious themes. People who know me in real life will be unsurprised to know that I did the thing again. I started with a very small basic idea and it spiraled into 1,000 tangents, and when you look at that, I have a 2-hour video to edit. So if you like this video and want to see a similar breakdown of one of those two, leave a like and a comment letting me know. I have a bunch of other things I'd like to do equally as much, and for the sake of variety, I'm not going to keep releasing John Wick videos back to back unless you really want me to. In the meantime, subscribe to catch the next one either way, and why not check out some other videos like this on the channel or on our sister channels UDS Gaming and UDS Music. My name's Drew, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you here.